Hello, Joseph, as I like to call people. Good to see you. Good to meet you.
Yeah, it's not many people do call me Joseph, but I do like it. Yeah, I do like it.
Well, this is the Welsh background, isn't it? With a name like Jones, I know I want to talk to you about a lot of different topics around being editor of the Friend and things like that. But actually, Joseph Jones, what a good Welsh chapel name.
Yeah, although there's no J in Welsh, right? So it's slightly kind of ironic, but yeah,
I
yeah.
know, I know. So So can we start then by learning a little bit about you and your background and I suppose, your spiritual journey. You've ended up here as editor of The Friend, that's where we all know you, which is a religious magazine and it's representing a religious society of friends. So can you tell us a bit about your own spiritual background and how you've ended up in this role?
Yeah, sure. So, like you say, Welsh. So I grew up Welsh Chapel, the Valley Welsh Chapel, a place called Aberdare, which is it's in the Cannon Valley, which is kind of nestled between Merthyr that people have heard of and the Rhondda the other side.
Mhm.
So, but the kind of place where you can never get lost because there's mountains either side, so you've either gone too far or not far enough. So, you know the kind of place. And yeah, chapel family. My mum and dad met at a church conference, and so both sides of the family. I've got pastors in my family, my uncles, my grandparents, all kind of non-conformist chapel
Yeah,
leaders.
so that's Annibynwyr then in the
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I mean, so the denomination that I grew up in was called the Apostolic Church, and the background is that it started like Congregationalist, and I think I would have enjoyed that more because at some point early in the 20th century there was a chap who decided Congregationalist meetings were too haphazard, and he wanted to be in charge. So he set up this denomination called the Apostolic Church, where you had apostolic succession and pastors and elders and deacons, so on. So, and yeah, pretty patriarchal, but retained something of that congregationalist aspect. So our Sunday morning meetings, actually anybody could stand up and speak. Like Quakerism in that sense, and a Pentecostal movement because the church goes through the Welsh revival in the early 20th century. So it's Pentecostal, and again I find links with Pentecostalism and Quakerism in that there's something about that thing that we read of in Scripture that is made true for us today by the Spirit in this moment. So I retained that much, I think, of my church upbringing, but it was very patriarchal. It was very conservative, and then when I went away to university and started to meet more gay people, for example, and thought, this doesn't marry with my traditional conservative theology. And I started looking at other traditions that were a bit more accepting. So, I mean, it still isn't, but I moved into Anglicanism. I was particularly impressed by Rowan Williams.
Mm.
But it was about that time that he became Archbishop of Canterbury, not Archbishop of Wales. That I was just impressed by what he was. He was very interested in how culture worked and how we could speak spiritually to culture and what culture told us about ourselves spiritually. And so at university, I did politics, and then I did a master's degree back at Cardiff. My mum had died, so I went back to Cardiff to study for a master's, and that was in culture and critical theory. So I was very interested in
Mm.
philosophy, culture, these kinds of things. But then when I left university, I went into publishing. So my first job was as a publishing assistant. But I'd always been writing. I always wanted to be a journalist, actually, and I started writing for Scripture Union. So they used to do daily Bible readings. I can't Daily Bread, I think they were called, and there were some youth ones and stuff. So I used to write for those, and then I applied to work for a magazine called Third Way. which was a liberal evangelical magazine that ran from the 70s till the early 2000s. And again, it was kind of it tried to have a sort of liberalizing effect on evangelical communities. We tried to be affirming where we could. We tried to see how what the Spirit was saying to us today. So any views that evangelicals might have held, that the Spirit might be asking us to take another look at. And again, it was very interested in wider culture to find out what that said about ourselves. And we interviewed lots of people from different walks of life. So that's where I kept a lot of my interviewing teeth, really, interviewing, lots of poets, lots of politicians, really trying to find out, not the usual kinds of interviews, but find out what were the values behind the politics that they operated in, or the poetry that they wrote, right across the spectrum. I really enjoyed that. But then the magazine was bought by a company called Hymns Ancient and Modern, which also owned the Church Times. And so I ended up working for the Church Times. I was the assistant editor there for a while. Again, sort of day-to-day journalism. But I got really cheesed off with, anytime an archbishop said anything, and by now the archbishop had changed, or anytime a bishop said anything, we had to rush off and write down everything that this bishop said as if it was holy writ. And, my nonconformist background just kind of itched at that. And also when I looked at the kinds of people who were bishops, particular kinds of backgrounds, obviously male at that time, and it just didn't, I wasn't enjoying that really, that aspect of it. There was a lot of it that I did. They gave me free rein to write, and again interviewed a lot of interesting people, but was interested in. I was still felt strongly about there being more to life than just here, us individual rational selves. I always felt like there was more. So I didn't, even though I was frustrated with churches, I knew there was something I wanted to hold on to. And then that's when Quakerism just seemed to slot in. We'd always published Quakers in the magazine, and I'd always been interested, and I'd always thought the Quakers seemed like good people. But something in that conservative background itched at me. There was something not quite proper about Quakers, in that they didn't take scripture seriously, that kind of thing. But I just tried it out, and it just sat well with me. It sort of, I found a resonance with it, and actually, it sort of almost coincided with the fact that I went to work for BYM as the publications manager, because I was getting cheesed off for the Church Times. So obviously you go to BYM to work, and I'd been to a few Quaker meetings, and I'd been to Quaker weddings and Quaker funerals, and it seemed like a good fit. There's still lots of things about Quakerism that I itch at too. Like my soul is always itching at something. But yes, I started to feel like I'd found a home. And then I'd been at BYM a couple of years, and the job at the Friend came up. And obviously my publications background, I'd edited magazines before, felt like I was starting to understand Quakerism and Quakers, the community of friends, a bit better. So I applied for that, and for good or ill, got the job.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and here you are.
Yeah.
So are you regularly worshipping with Quakers? Are you a member of?
Yeah, so well, no, I'm not a member. I've not quite done that. It's partly because I've not really settled on one particular meeting. My local meeting really is Stoke Newington meeting, but I used to take my son there on Sunday mornings. But as he got older, and then they shifted the time of the meeting, so I couldn't get there as regularly. So I skip about between other London meetings. and at friends' house. But I don't get to any of them regularly enough to feel like I'm properly a member of them. So I've never quite done that. And yeah, again, when you're writing about things, like I was when I was a member of the Labour Party, I always felt that I couldn't write about the Labour Party objectively because I was a member. So I always came into it with particular agendas, and there's something there in terms of writing about friends. I mean, it doesn't make any sense really, but there's just something there that's. I imagine that if I move on to something else, that'll be the time that I become a member.
I see, yeah. So there's a kind of, you feel a kind of independence then. You feel a kind of stepping back and some distance.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, and I think I probably don't quite have that quite right, but that's why that is the case.
Mm. I was really struck by you saying, there's a difference, isn't there, between kind of Quakerism and Quakers, individuals
Yeah,
that you interact with.
yeah.
Um, what are your first impressions then around? I mean, how what do you make of Quakerism, if you like? How do you describe it, and what is it?
Wow,
Because
that's quite the
as an
question.
editor of a magazine, I think this
Yeah.
is really quite interesting, isn't it? Like your perceptions and the way you think of it and describe it and conceptualize it is interesting.
Yeah, so my my first impressions were that I just didn't have to deal with any of the things in Anglicanism, particularly where I was always crossing my fingers. They'd say the creed, and I'd cross my fingers, and certain we'd pray for Elizabeth our Queen, and it. So I never had to deal with any of that. It was the first thing. It was like I could just breathe into what it was. I felt like we as a community, or I as an individual, were pursuing without being encumbered by this sort of daftness of those kinds of things. Which is, not to say that there's something about ritual. I love singing. I still sing, so I miss that about my old church communities. But yeah, to being settled into not having to go along with anybody else's
Mm,
liturgical nonsense, or what seemed to me like nonsense. It's not. I'm sure there are many deeply held feelings about these things. I don't want to dismiss them, but to me, they didn't. I had to cross my fingers. So it was that kind of the sort of liberty around that, and then of course what came next was the fact that it's not actually liberty. I remember there used to be this old sticker that you could get that said something like "Thou shalt do whatever thou want" or something. That came to when it came to Quakers, like the Quaker commandment: "Thou shalt not be told what to do." And actually, I found that it doesn't work that way. You very much are told what to do, but by the Spirit, by your listening, by your
yeah.
careful attention.
Mm,
That's what limits the things that you do, rather than just you deciding. It's not that kind of free for all liberty at all. In fact, it's much more constraining in lots of ways.
mm,
So there was that process, and then culturally, I mean, to be honest, one of the first things I noticed was the age, because I'd come from communities, families, younger people. I guess I was involved for quite a long time with the Greenbelt Festival, which is an arts, faith, and justice festival. And so I found a young community of like-minded people that I still have plenty of friends there. Um, and so when I started worshiping with friends, you can't help but notice all the grey hair, and I've got absolutely nothing against um, um, being with older friends at all. So what I'm saying is, I guess I noticed the absence of younger people.
mm,
That was one. And then I've always been very interested in culture and the arts, and I think Quakers have a particular attitude to the arts, which again I itch at, which is sometimes that if you're making art, it must make a statement. It must say something about the world, and a lot of that is amazing. Like I think there have been amazing Quaker projects. The Living Earth project is amazing,
Mm.
drawing people's attention to climate and so on. But it is an example of how Quakers think of the arts as things to make points with. They're kind of sermons in pretty form. And I never really thought that way about art, and I miss that. Uh, Great art, I think, comes at you accidentally. The spirit sneaks in subtle ways rather than being hit in the face with a message. I remember I can't remember how old I was, late teens probably, going to see Tracy Emin's Bed. And everything I knew about Tracy Emin with my conservative background, that I didn't see that there was going to be much of a match, but I was completely blown away. It just snuck up on me looking at this bed, this woman who's not much older than me, and how different she had to live in her particular situation with her, in her sex, um, you know, the kind of different pills she had to take, the accoutrements that were needed, the makeup, the tight underwear, all the stuff that I never had to deal with. And I just found it eye-opening in a really unexpected way. And that's just as an example of what art has always done to me.
Mm.
And I struggle to find Quakers who 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 kind of sympathize or empathize with the artistic process in that way. But on the other hand, I sat and worshiped with people in steeple houses where they were just not interested in applying their faith to make the world more just, which I always found central, certainly to Jesus' message, but to the right through the scriptures, the message of justice. And I've never sat among people so dedicated to that, I think, in whether political movements, whatever kinds of meetings. I really value the fact that friends seek justice in a compassionate way, without being bombastic about it, without being violent about it. It's really worth cherishing that there aren't many communities. I don't know of another community like it.
Mm. So are you Christian then? Are you still identified as Christian and worship in a Christian way? And how does that go down in the Quaker meetings you've been at?
So I love the emancipatory logic of the gospel. There's something about that won't let me go. But do I believe in the virgin birth? Do I believe in, well, with Wittgenstein on that, what we can't know, we pass over in silence. I interviewed Maya Angelou once, the American writer, and she said, I think we asked her, was she a Christian? And she said, I would never call myself a Christian, but after I'm gone, if people say she was Christian, then I'll be glad. And so that sense of what does it mean to have been a Christian in the world for other people? I think that's something I can't quite let go of. But resurrection, virgin birth, letter and chapter and verse,
Mm.
I'm not so interested in.
Yeah. It's interesting because when you were just talking about Tracy Emin's bed, I remember seeing it, and of course I would have been probably mid-20s
Right.
myself, and I remember thinking, what? It's just a bed. Like and
Yeah.
and and what you've just described is the first time I've ever seen it from a different perspective, if you see what
Right.
I mean. Like
Yeah.
I'm not an art person, and I probably whistled through the gallery thinking, why have somebody dragged me around this art
Mm.
gallery? and it literally looked to me like my own bedroom. So like, I mean, I didn't use makeup, but it just didn't look anything out of the ordinary at all. And
Right.
now when I'm thinking about, here we are trying to think about whether we fit into Quakers, and what do we see
Mm.
as Quakers when we look at the Quaker organization and culture and church. It's very much guided, isn't it, by what we don't often see, the things that are most apparent,
Yeah.
if that makes sense, to other people.
Yeah. Yeah. We can. One of the things I'm always thinking about, when we look back at even Quakers in history and these massive blind spots that we had, that we can't believe that people turned a blind eye to, slavery being one of the most obvious examples.
Mm.
And so I'm thinking, what are our blind spots today? What are the things that we don't see about ourselves?
Mm.
Um, and yeah, it's really hard to step out of oneself to
Mm.
look at oneself.
Mm.
That's one, but I do think that happens in meeting sometimes. This thing comes from outside. So to to try to nail down a thing that I could say that I believe that in meeting for worship, this thing comes that is not just the individual reasons of the people present. There is an extra thing that happens,
Mm.
um, and that, I think, sometimes can be a chink into seeing something from a perspective that isn't just ours.
Yeah. Because I mean, I was just thinking, I was in a cell in the prison talking to a very young man, he's 18, and he was talking about his real mother who died and his foster mother. And I mean, I've been a foster parent myself, and he was talking about this foster mother as she's not my mother, which is fair enough because it doesn't want to take away from his birth mother, but he was saying, she's properly Christian.
Right.
And it kind of, you made me think of that just now when you're thinking about you want to be seen as Christian. But I'm very much taken by this idea that we're so immersed in Christian culture, and perhaps more so in Wales than the rest of the country. I
Mm,
don't really
mm,
understand. Again, I can't see it from an English person's perspective. I lived in
mm,
Yorkshire for 20 years, but
right.
to me, this is a Christian culture that we swim in and we move in, and we don't, if we don't see it, it's because it's just like water to us.
Mm.
Would you agree with that? Or, I mean, I don't know if we perhaps both come from a Welsh chapel background. Maybe there's a similarity in our experience in that respect. I'm not entirely sure.
Well, particularly recently, I find it's a difficult thing to wrestle with because right now, the people who are saying this is a Christian country, this is a Christian culture, tend to be the people. What they're actually saying is this is not a Muslim country,
Mm.
this
Mm.
is not a Hindu country, this is
Mm.
a country for white people like us. And this, so I mean, again, I don't want to talk about anybody's individual spirituality, but the fact that Tommy Robinson from the
Mm.
English Defence League is um, arguing for himself as a Christian and the country as a Christian country. And I think even a bit more intellectually than that, you see, Jordan Peterson has been talking about his whatever his belief is in God and how it creates the culture that we're in. And I think again, I find quite a lot of that problematic. So I'm careful about how um, I say it and how I try to think about it. But I think it's true for me that when I look back at pre-Christian cultures, so the Romans and Greeks, and try to figure out the kind of the way they lived in the world, the kinds of cultures to which Christianity is taken, and even into which Jesus arrives. Jesus arrives into a Roman occupied country. and I do think he flips that on his head. I do think he instigates a new way of being in the world that thinks in ways that are more compassionate, and it changes law. It changes, ultimately, it changes the rest of culture in ways I think we would be sorry to lose, and we don't know what. We don't always think about that's where they come from, and I can see why somebody might say that it doesn't matter where it comes from. Some of our morality comes from the Greek philosophers. They might argue, and I think that's probably fair to say too. But I think you're right. I think there are things about our interactions with each other that have Christianity somewhere in the bottom of it. I just don't like talking about it in the culture where to say that we're culturally Christian means we're saying we don't want Muslim people here.
Well, yes, and I think this is where you see, I'm always of the view that you must speak your own version of what you believe rather than just saying, oh, well, I can't say X, Y, and Z because those people over there are saying similar things. Because, I wouldn't, I sometimes feel that Quakers get so caught up in this, and I wouldn't talk about Christianity because Tommy Robinson's become a Christian.
Mm.
And you think, well, we've got to maintain our own integrity and maintain our own path. And I sometimes feel that there's a little bit of avoidance of Christianity within Quaker circles, and maybe that's starting to shift, but because they don't want to be tarred with that brush, and I think it's taking it too far myself. Um,
Yeah, but I think ultimately because I'm not sure that I would call myself that or not. I think it's probably down to the people who are confident that that's what they are. They are the ones who have to say, well, this is what Christianity is, so that when other people want to use it for other agendas, they're the ones who defend it. I can't, because I can't completely identify with the label. It's trickier. I mean, I can certainly say that I think the things Tommy Robinson stands for are outside and, in fact, opposite some of the things that I believe Jesus stood for. But in terms of whether or not he's a Christian, well, I mean, I think it's maybe for other people who identify as Christians to say, identify more completely as Christians, I would say.
it's interesting though, isn't it? So once, because it's what's that other chap, Russell Brand and people like that.
Mm,
I mean,
hmm
there's all
hmm
sorts of people now, isn't there?
hmm Yeah,
Um, But it does intrigue me that once people like that identify as Christian, people, if you like, at maybe the other end of a spectrum, if that's an accurate way to describe it, start disassociating themselves from
yeah.
Christianity. And I'm not so comfortable with that. I would much prefer people to be more confident, as you say, in their own interpretation, really. Um, and I suppose this all gets to all of these editorial decisions you're making in the Friend, isn't it? I wonder if we can come on to thinking about like what is the Friend for in your mind? What is the purpose of the Friend as a weekly magazine in Britain? So we know that, but what's his purpose?
Yeah, so obviously we spend quite a lot of time thinking about that. Our trustees do, our staff do, and certainly it's about supporting and nourishing friends in their faith. It's about connecting friends with the wider community of friends, nationally and to a certain degree internationally. And it's about allowing friends to access the expressions of faith that are given by other friends. So they get a sense of where the community is. And look, okay, so there are all sorts of things that break the rules. I was just having a conversation with our staff this morning about something that we'd done that we wouldn't ordinarily do. And I believe sometimes you have to break the rules to remind yourself where the rules are. um, and so, so for example, one Christmas, we did a special Christmas issue where we got people to write about each of the characters in the Christmas and Epiphany story. And I asked a Muslim friend to, sorry, not a Muslim friend, lowercase f. So I asked a Muslim to write about the Magi, as a kind of, because they felt to me like they came from outside of the story into the story. And and yeah, so there's something about that appealed to me. And I think friends enjoyed that sort of, but we badged it a particular way. We didn't say this is inside the, what we understand to be the kind of Quaker hinterland. So, and occasionally we'll go outside the borders. But generally speaking, I think it's about helping friends support and nourish each other through their expressions of faith as it comes to them.
Because I asked a few friends, I said, "Oh, I'm speaking to Joe later. What questions do you have for them?" So I might ask you some of those in
Yeah.
between our questions, because one of the things that we were talking about, well, what does success look like? And what, he said, if the friend is possibly a key strand of Quaker public discourse, how does he measure his success in making it rich and thought-provoking?
Yeah, such a good question, because and we can ask these at every layer of identification that we've talked about so far. We can talk, so what would it be to be a successful Christian? What would it be to be a successful Quaker? Is being successful having 150 people at every one of our meetings? Or is being successful being able to resist and advocate for new policy, for changes in governance, for justice in the world? And Christians could answer those in the same way. I think at the baseline level, success for us is if the community understands itself better, because it can read about the expressions of itself in the friends, so we know who we are as a yearly meeting because we read about ourselves in the friend. We know what's happening. We know what the issues of conversation are. We know we are guided by people who have been given ministry on particular subjects. We are enlightened and inspired by things that friends are doing across the yearly meeting. So that's the simplest way, I think, is, and I think one example of that might be, we're pretty diligent, or we try to be diligent about our coverage of meeting for sufferings and yearly meeting. You don't get that anywhere else.
No.
The number of meetings we sit through diligently recording what happens, trying to relay it objectively to people who either weren't there or were there and are processing it and reminding themselves of what happened, as a kind of record of decisions we've made, discernment we've undertaken, to communicate that to friends, I think is really important. And I think, we take it seriously and hope, and that's some of the best feedback we get is about our coverage of those meetings. So, I don't, often when people think about business success, I mean, there is we're a non-profit organization, so success for us is not making £1 million a month, but success to a certain degree is making sure that we do well enough to carry on.
Mm.
And in an age where people aren't buying print publications anymore, that becomes more difficult. So we have to communicate in different ways. Our website now is pretty sharp looking, I think. It's pretty well used, but it's very hard to monetize it. And I don't say monetize it because, as I say, we need to make profit. I say monetize it because it needs to pay for staff who can do the reporting, etc., etc., who can do the uploading, who can do the layout. So to a certain degree, we have to have a certain amount of income in order to maintain the things that we are good at in terms of communicating to friends, the wider, an appreciation of the wider community. So there's a certain degree of commercial kind of success that we need, and that it's tricky, the publishing landscape today is absolutely not the one I joined. Don't tell anybody who's gone to university to look for a career in publishing, because there's less and less of it. Well, to a degree, there's less and less. There's less mass production of stuff. I think there are still strong, niche, beautiful publications out there that do a lot of good and mean a lot to people. And it's just our job to try to be one of them.
Give us some sense of the numbers. What's your subscription numbers at the moment, and what do you estimate the readership?
Yeah, so here's an interesting thing. When I joined in 2018, I think it was, and one of our staff told me that the friend hit was sold to, which is to say, I think it's 12% of Quakers. So 12% of Quakers purchase a copy of the friend. Now that's not to say that it's read by 12%, because every copy is almost every copy is shared. Some copies shared number of times, and that doesn't count for the copies that go to meetings that circulate and so on. So our penetration is certainly a lot higher than that. But in terms of one-for-one sales, you could say for every 12 Quakers, one Quaker buys a copy. That's been true since as long as we've been keeping records. So, all sorts of editors have done all sorts of things over all sorts of periods of times, and that penetration has not changed a bit. It's really interesting, and all the time, every editor comes across, so it's not like it used to be, or this is different, and this has changed, and it's down. But the penetration has remained exactly the same, whatever any editor has done over time. Difficult to calculate that online. I think our penetration online has probably changed some of that, but as the numbers go, and of course that's part of what makes it difficult for us, because as there are fewer Quakers, so that 12% penetration. Sorry, so I said 1 in 12 earlier, didn't I? I don't mean 1 in 12. I mean 12%. That penetration, as there are fewer Quakers, so there are fewer purchases of the friend. But I do know, you can always tell, because as soon as you publish something that is considered to be controversial in any way, every Quaker knows about it. You hear about it from people who don't read, or that. So the kind of intellectual penetration is pretty deep, I think. There are numbers which because we're going public, we have to keep some of that commercially sensitive, because it matters to advertisers and so on. I can't tell you exactly, but you can work it out, in terms of the numbers of copies sold. You can work it out from that 12% figure. And of course, we have different rates now. So you can be a standard subscriber of the friend, you can be a supporter of the Friend, so the subscription costs a little more, so that we can also offer a supported tier so that you can pay a little less, which is, it's not quite full justice, but we do say that nobody who wants a copy of the Friend should have to go without, and I think we find ways to do that most of the time.
So is it moving more online then? Because I mean, I don't read it online, but again, as you've just said, if something happens in the online responses, I tend to get told
Yeah,
about it by a friend.
yeah,
Do you know what so and so said?
yeah,
So I think that's the kind of grapevine effect, I
yeah.
suppose. But do you think there is a move away from paper and towards online?
Well, I believe in paper. I believe, I'm a pretty analog person as far as these. I've got a record player right here, and so I write with a fountain pen. I'm a pretty analog kind of a guy. I believe in the beauty of print, but absolutely, a lot of people engage on the internet. It's not my favorite way that they do, mostly because you can be more piecemeal about it, and you can get hung up on, one of the things about reading the print, you'll read something on one page and you'll think, oh, I disagree with that. And then you're on to the next page and it maybe warms you back up. And through the end, it's like a journey where you've
Yeah.
gone up and down and empathy, agreement, whatever. And on the website, you can be a lot more piecemeal about it. And so some of the responses can be more pointed. I think it's more, weirdly, is less personal, I think. And that seems to be the way that people reply. It's interesting, the letters to the editor that we get, if anybody ever writes with a paper or even a typewriter, those letters are almost never strongly worded, in terms of criticism or I mean, we get criticism that way, but it's never what I'd call unquakerly. When somebody takes the time to do it with a pen, if somebody does it by email or online, the chances of it being ad hominem or abusive just escalate enormously. Um, so again, I think there's something about internet engagement that I don't warm to as much as I do, to the engagement of people who read it in paper. But unquestionably, it's a way people access it, and we want to be there for them as we are everywhere else.
Yeah, and it's a speed thing, isn't it? Is that if I'm sat reading at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, then it's a slow thing, whereas online it's much faster,
Yeah,
really. Um, and I notice that as a chaplain, I try to slow things down sometimes, and not everyone likes that. Some
right.
people like to be speeded back up again. Um, so do you feel then that you just said about kind of reflecting the society back to itself, and I wondered whether that's just a reflection or if there's influence in there. And again, that's one of the questions a friend sent me. Do you think that the friend is seeking to influence the national debate? Or debate is not the national, ways of discourse, I suppose.
So there's, I guess we have to be honest with us. I have biases, I have points of view, I have subjectivities, and I'm not, you know, hubristic enough to say that I could keep those out with the friend completely. Of course, they end up in the friend. I'm a human being with thoughts and opinions and beliefs that I can't completely eradicate. My aim is that we allow the spirit to influence the society through the people who write for it. It's different writing from the friend and standing and giving vocal ministry in meeting, but sometimes the things people write in the friend are ministry to other friends. I think that's
Mm.
it's not all, it's not all aimed to be, but some of it is. Um, but I don't set an agenda. I don't sit down with our staff and say, okay, our readers don't care enough about um, um, the 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 injustices of the cocoa trade. Okay, and so we need to persuade friends that they shouldn't buy chocolate. Um, that's I've written about that, but and so has Rebecca. But it's not something that we say. This is a thing that we're going to try to make happen. There are times I thought we could do that. We could see particular changes that we could try to encourage within the society, structurally, the way we write about particular changes, even if it's just reporting them as news, can lead people in particular directions. It's always been very important to me that we don't move outside what I understand to be the discerned position of the yearly meeting. Now we can operate while discernment is underway. So if friends are discussing, for example, end of life care, we can have people talk about end of life care according to their own experiences, viewpoints, beliefs, as led. And as it happens, that's an issue that really I think is probably still held pretty open. In that we don't have a discerned position where we're going to advocate for the right to end your own life. We haven't got there, even though we have friends who do believe that, and we have friends who don't believe that. I think the last time it came up, we didn't move that way. So that's a thing. It's an example of a thing that we can talk about. But once the yearly meeting has a discerned position, I feel it's important for us to operate with that as a guideline. So once decisions are made about, can we call what's happening in Gaza a genocide? Well, we can use that word in the friend now, because the community of friends has decided that in certain contexts it's an appropriate word to use. Might we have used it before while the discussion was happening? Well, maybe, but we'd have been a lot more careful about it. So I think it's inevitably true that if somebody writes a particularly persuasive piece in the friend, that it might change other friends' minds. But I don't set out to say friends' minds need to be changed on a particular subject. Um, there are subjects I think we need to make sure that we pay enough diligence to. We wouldn't be a Quaker magazine if we didn't make sure that we covered certain kinds of campaigning and work for peace, certain kinds of campaigning and work for climate justice. These are things that to not cover them would be to not be representative of where we were as a community. So there are some subjects that we have to hit, but I do find that happens pretty naturally from the people who write to us and want to express themselves in particular ways. But it almost never happens that we publish something that I think this is outside what the yearly meeting has discerned as its position.
And I suppose I'm left wondering about your role as a journalist in the sense of if you feel something's not quite in right ordering, or you think there's a a mismatch in some way. So, you spoke earlier about having a ringside seat at Meeting for Sufferings and
Hmm.
watching all of that
Hmm.
unfold. And I've heard an account of a Meeting for Sufferings feeling a sense of the meeting and then a kind of a fairly shocked room when the minute comes back and it's like that's not matching what happened. And to see then your written account of it in quite factual terms, I suppose the background to that, I suppose, is there's a feeling amongst some, I'm sure you will know, that there's particular ideological forces and um, ways of thinking and ways of doing things which are being quite dominant in the society and are pushing narratives, if you like. And I read a term the other day, narrative journalism, the extent to which you're pushing a particular agenda. And even if you're not doing it, do you sometimes see that at work? And what kind of what kind of decisions do you have to take then about how you report what you've seen?
Yeah, there are the number of times I've sat in yearly meeting or sufferings thinking a very particular thing, thinking of having a strong reaction to something that's been said, and trying to make sure that I work with my own, recognizing my own feelings when I write about it. And sometimes, if you're a careful reader, you'll sometimes read between the lines what I think I did something recently. There was a friend who I thought spoke very eloquently about not giving the loyal address to the king. I thought he was very eloquent, and then there was some subsequent ministry that didn't resonate with me at all. So it was, and it so happened that there weren't any. I think there was one young friend in the whole meeting, and it couldn't help feeling that some of the responses might have been different if the composition of the meeting had been different.
Mm.
Um, which is why I'm I'm glad that we're moving to a system whereby we can invite more people to our discernment in a continuing yearly meeting.
Yeah.
With, and I mean, how it all works out, nobody knows. We're yet to see.
Oh.
But certainly, I've sat in too many of those meetings thinking, whereas we try to be a representation of the society as a magazine, and I think each of the representatives at Sufferings does, as a group, they certainly aren't, or certainly haven't been. Um, but they're, one of the things people ask, you know, does it feel stage managed to you? Does it feel like it's being asked to go in a particular direction? And I would say I've seen it. I've been at Sufferings and felt like representatives were being asked to go in a particular way, being taken in a particular way. But I've also seen representatives stand up and say, we won't be taken that way. We want to take our time. So um, generally speaking, I think our discernment is pretty careful and also robust, which is one of the reasons why we take them as guidelines for what we put in the friend, for not going out with the discernment of friends, because we believe in the discernment of friends. We think it's robust. Um, I don't know if there. I get the feeling that you might be itching at particular subjects, as people often are
Well,
when they.
I don't necessarily want us to get into a specific subject because I suppose what I'm asking in general is would you call out let's just say the stage management that you've just talked about, which is something that experienced friends will know exactly what you're talking about because we've all seen that. Um, and there's particular emotional kind of building blocks you can see happens, and it happens in yearly meeting as well. Um, and I think stage management would be a good way of putting it of the account that I heard. But I suppose what I'm asking is, would you call it out if you saw it and you thought that felt to me like that minute that came back was not really a reflection of what's just happened, but it was like a preconceived stage managed outcome. Would you feel that the friend has any role in pointing that out or making it obvious?
Well, so let's unpick what it is I think you might be asking me to do. So if we're talking about a minute that arrives from the clerk and is given to a room full of representatives, 100 representatives, each, I believe, attending to the spirit as best they can, hearts and minds prepared as best they can, imperfectly, human, but attentive as they can. A minute comes to them, they're all dealing with it in this spirit, and they say ultimately, usually after all sorts of amendments, this will do. And then you're asking me to say, take my own sense of the meeting, my own sense of what's been stage managed or not, and say, it's more important that I put my own interpretation than the 100 friends who received the minute, who were actually attentive in a way that I'm not. I'm scribbling at the back. I'm sort of in the meeting, but not really. It's a very complicated sort of mind soul set. But there are 100 people who are, and they've decided the minute serves them. It's very difficult to say that I should then be saying, well, they're all wrong. The minute shouldn't have been that way.
No, and I think I'm asking something slightly different in the sense of the process. Now, I think, for example, the what you might call the weaponization of time or the weaponization of agenda management. So I suppose in the more specifics, I'm talking about, we haven't got time to discuss this further, and the minute is arrived at in with very short shrift. And so essentially, I've had people come to me and say that they've been deeply disturbed by how that happened. And I suppose I'm asking if you had been deeply disturbed by the process, would you call it out? So I take the difficulties that you're talking about. You're not particularly 100% being able to concentrate because you're writing, and it wouldn't be your place to say those kinds of things. But I suppose I am left with a sense of, I mean, this comes back to journalism, doesn't it? And we're talking about kind of what is the media nowadays when I'm here publishing this kind of commentary on YouTube. Um, And there are certain things which make me think, it makes me wince, if you like. I think that's to hear a Meeting for Suffering's rep say to me of how bothered they were by the process and the way in which something was rushed through. I feel okay to say that now to you in an interview that I know is going to be watched. I
Yeah.
think it's okay to call it out.
Yeah. So if I'm trying to think of a fairly safe subject. When they changed the name of what used to be the William Penn room at Friend's house,
Oh.
that was done by yearly meeting, really. Or was no, it wasn't done by I can't no, it wasn't done by yearly meeting, but it was certainly something that could have been raised at yearly meeting. When they decided to change it, we got literally hundreds of letters, some in favour, a lot, still hundreds saying we this is, the people didn't agree with it. Then we went to yearly meeting not long afterwards, and all of these people with all of these views, with the opportunity to express them at yearly meeting, chose not to. And So I'm left thinking they were given the opportunity and didn't take it. Does that mean that when they were in the meeting, they came to a sense of it's not important enough, it's not material, it doesn't matter enough? There is, I know, friends can feel afraid of looking a particular way, being labeled in a particular way. We, on the other side of this, we all know friends who are considered, everybody knows that they're awkward customers because they stand at the wrong time and they speak for two, just as we can talk about stage management, we can also talk about this sort of thing happening. But not a word happened. And I think, ultimately, I think what it meant was that the community of friends in Discernment did not think that it was important enough to change, to raise and change, even voice a kind of opinion on it. And so at that point, we were still getting letters. I said, look, everybody had the opportunity to change this at yearly meeting. You could have just gone to yearly meeting and said any of these
So there
things.
was an opportunity, was there? It came to as an agenda item. It
I
came.
don't know if it was specific. I don't remember. But I remember they were close enough subjects. I think whether we were discussing racism or slavery or whatever, but there were subjects that came up whereupon it could very easily have been brought up, and wasn't. And so, we were still getting letters in the friend. I said, look, everybody's had the chance. You had the chance at yearly meeting to raise this, to bring it up to, and nobody did. So therefore, that's what the community of friends decided. And you were part of it and you decided not to raise it. And and sometimes it's sufferings. Sometimes I do have those feelings, but I can't say that my feelings are more important than the people who
No.
could have raised it and didn't.
Yeah. No, I get that. So while we're on this subject of kind of, would you call it out? One of the other things that came up when I was speaking to someone about this interview was what your conception is of what the recording clerk's role is, because it's very interesting to me. At the very beginning, you spoke about the apostolic tradition, and I suppose one of the subtext of this conversation I had with a friend was about an interview that you did with the recording clerk a couple of years ago, was it? And it's a big
Mm-hmm.
two-page spread, and the use of the word shepherding.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to me, Joe used the word shepherding, and there was this implication that you see the recording clerk as some kind of pope and some kind of, um, you know, yeah, in the apostolic tradition, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't see Paul as a pope. So let's bear in mind, my first encounters with Paul were the week I first arrived at BYM as publications manager. So he was my boss for a while. So I've seen him operate in that way as a manager of staff, as well as the recording clerk. I can't remember the specific context that I said the word shepherding. And yeah, so let me think about that for a second, about whether or not I think he does and whether or not I think he should. Um, yeah, so when I think about it, the other word that comes up is corral. Like you're trying to corral processes, really. So you're trying to get things to come together into a shape. You're trying to make sense of a cloud of things and bring them into an achievable, or into an agenda item, or into a thing that can be discussed. You're trying to, bring all these disparate things into a thing that can be presented and discerned. That I think, I think that's shepherding, and I think that's valuable shepherding. I think somebody needs to do that. I think if nobody does that, then we don't make any progress. And I also don't have any problem with the word, leading. There are people who have led us in all sorts of ways, and that's one of them. And I think that's entirely appropriate. He's also a representative for us in external bodies. That's it's not a pope, but it's he and Tim at Friends World FWCC. Inevitably, they are representatives of our yearly meeting anyway. For Tim, for our movement, and that's I guess a kind of popish role in a way. It doesn't mean what pope means, and it doesn't mean what like this. I don't mean shepherding as in telling us exactly what to do. I don't think that's the role of Recording Clerk. I don't think he'd see it that way either. But somebody has to bring disparate things into approachable form.
Mm. I'm thinking about our external, you just talked there about having to represent us externally. Do you think that there's always been talk of Quakers kind of punching above our weight or having a bigger influence than our numbers, but do you think our influence is declining? Because one of the things that it was pointed out to me a while ago now was that all of these press releases and all of these statements are never picked up by the wider media. And I wondered if you've got some sense of that.
Well, you've got to bear in mind that because we see them at the Friend all the time, if people are agitated by particular issues, as they should be, by particular issues of justice, by particular events that have happened, they want to know that the yearly meeting is on their side, that sees it the same way. And so sometimes, even though these press releases don't end up on the headline on The Guardian, the Friend on the bench sees that the wider community of friends is advocating for the same thing, that it is not being silent on the issue. So yeah, I don't think the aim of those things is always that they end up as a mass media headline. It's about letting friends know that we understand how they felt about a particular subject, and sometimes they're expressions of interfaith support, or
Yeah.
I think there was one on after the Bondi Beach shooting, wasn't there? There was an expression of sympathy, those kinds of things. And I think largely that's the service that they offer. I don't think they're about trying to make us popular.
No, well, no, I don't think so. I suppose m one of my worries is that it puts off as many people as it reassures, if you like. When you say the friend on the bench, some of the things that they put out, it doesn't make me feel better. But so I just wonder why uh, are they doing it too much? Is obviously one of the points that I keep making. Uh,
Well, do you mean that friends are put off because it makes the society seem like a political?
yes, exactly. It's a campaigning thing. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to say, because my experience in the prison chapel is that when I do a Quaker spiritual practice, when I do it with people and I help them settle into silence and to share some of our advices and queries or whatever it might be, and to form a community over a course of an hour, we all have a very powerful experience, and it does change people's lives. And you could even use then Christian language and say, bring people into the presence of God and etc. And that to me is what's important, our shared spiritual practice and the way in which we do community and live in God's presence. And I think all of that gets forgotten about. And all of this external image becomes about, as you just mentioned, Gaza and assisted dying and the climate and all sorts of other things. And I feel like we've lost some of our recognition of what we do together in spiritual practice. So I suppose it's more about if we reduced a little bit on all the campaigning stuff, the activism stuff, we'd have time to actually get back to, you know, the spiritual practice that is at our core.
I I think I hear you. I would say so. The new slogan I like, the radical, simple, spiritual. I think that sort of if you're going to have a three-word summation, I think that's about as good as it gets. I would say that all of this um, campaigning work, it comes out of the spiritual process, right? There's not people at friends' house when they make these statements. I don't think they're doing it because they are members of Greenpeace or of because their labor union is telling them to. I think they do it because they recognize that the feeling comes out of the spiritual process, spiritual movement. Um, Indeed, I think you could show me any statement that they've made at BYM, and I think I could probably show you the line of discernment from committees to sufferings to whatever. So they're the outcome of a spiritual process. Now, where I hear you is, I think we probably don't do a good job of saying this is how it comes. That we don't get here because we're left wing and because we're um, climate advocates. We get to climate advocacy and all kinds of justice campaigning because we're a spiritual movement that goes this direction, that works this way, and this is the outcome. Um, I think we could do better on that. They do a lot of these. I'm sure you've seen them. These short videos where they have people talking
Mm.
about their experience. They're quite often spiritual. I don't love those either. Mostly because I don't like our processes being broken down to the point of the individual. None of our discernment is individual discernment,
Mm.
and of course individuals have experiences, but I think I would agree that we could do more to say these things that we speak about come to us from our spiritual process.
Mm. And I wanted to just touch a bit on your own comment in the online friend where you responded to some criticism and you used the word cesspit and
Oh,
blurry. And I wondered whether, you just reminded me of it now because you were talking about independent and individual discernment. And I wonder if you perhaps see the worst of it then, because you're there as a an inbox receiving all of this stuff. Um, and again, another friend said to me, I was quite shocked by the language that Joe used there of what constitutes that and what is he seeing that the rest of us don't, and what does he think is happening? And I suppose I've just said, oh, you're getting that outpouring of anger at the end of a
yeah,
thing.
so just to
Yeah.
give people the context, there were somebody online had accused us of deliberately publishing things that were controversial in order to get more attention, um, which which um, believe me, there are many times where we could have done and chose not to. We have published things that are controversial to some people in all directions because we felt like that's the right thing to do and people should know. I think so. For example, I think BYM was very cross with us when we covered some allegations. There was um, one of the staff members at BYM had written to us to talk about the process of what was happening there with, I think it was redundancies and stuff at the time. And so we have very definitely cheesed off the institution when we felt like it was a thing that Friends needed to hear, or it was a friend that we thought Friends needed to hear from. But, you know, though publishing that stuff is always terrible because it makes for bad relationships, you know. So the next time I talked to, I think, their press officer at the time, it was very kind of, you know, we've just done this thing, you know. There, and of course, some of those things you have to. That's why the independence exists. That's why you have to have this step back in order to be able to say those things, and you have to have broad enough shoulders to go into those conversations and say, I think we were right, and I know you don't. I know you don't agree, but here we are. And to not be everybody's pal, you have to be able to do that. But they're awkward, and I don't love doing it, and I don't think it's a very Quakerly thing to do. So we don't. If we wanted to be controversial, we could be much more controversial than we are. So I was, and I think the person who had written, they were talking about particularly about the letters that we published, and I can absolutely say that we could be more controversial on the letters page. And you're right. So it's strong language, cesspit, and you're right. I knew what I was doing, which is why I also said slurry. I did it twice to make the point. You would not enjoy reading some of the letters we get sent on particular subjects that accusative of other people and of us. Some terrible language, sometimes aimed at different people, different organizations. And I know a lot of it comes from hurt and pain, and we have to be able to hold that. But we do a lot of holding of it. You know, if it's the inbox that we, it has quietened down again, I have to say. This toward the end of last year and this year, it's not so bad. But there was a period last year where I didn't want to open the inbox. You know, there was stuff in there that I think we were talking earlier about how easy it is just to fire something off out of anger. And I think what you forget when you do that is it lands somewhere. You know, you can't, if you throw a punch, then somebody's gonna get a sore chin. And it does feel like, you know, it did feel like a kind of, you know, cesspit barrel. Didn't want to put my hand in to find something that might be publishable. And I do, you know, I said it because I wanted to shock Friends into the realization that there are people in our community who at certain times will act in ways that we find unpleasant. And anybody who lives in community knows that. The extent of it, I think, probably would shock people. And I guess I just reached a point where, you know, when you're wading through this stuff and it's unpleasant and it weighs on you, I'm not quite sure how to help you with that. Oh, sorry, my thing kicked off. And when it's unpleasant and you're trying to deal with that, and then somebody's accusing you of trying to find the worst, and you just like, believe me, you know, it's not even. And I think it's probably true to say that we've published letters, and we put on the, you know, in all things charity, we've published letters in which people are not behaving charitably. But I also think it's, to a certain degree, you can't mandate charity on people. You can't, you know, to insist that somebody be loving is to negate their offer of it, you know, to negate someone's up. So sometimes there are letters that people have not enjoyed, and I do understand, if you, on all sorts of subjects, if people says something, it's going to feel like it's directed at you, and it's going to feel like you never want to read the letters page. I do. They have my sympathy. I can only say I read them all, and you got off lightly.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, I wasn't particularly surprised by your response, and I thought it was a bit unfair, that allegation. I think it said something about you're trying to sex up the
Yeah,
magazine, and I thought I don't get that impression myself, I must admit. And I say that as somebody who is cancelled, as you know. I mean, I am banned from speaking in certain well, all BYM spaces because I have views which are not deemed okay. So, and it's sometimes you do have. So I've been accused of being homophobic, you see, because I can't say something that's critical of gay culture. So it's really interesting as to how these kinds of things get decided upon. I mean, what when you talk about this the letters bag or the inbox or whatever, what are the topics that people are saying such upsetting things are? Is there the standard two or three main?
yeah. So over the last year or so, the trans issue has been particularly obnoxious. Also, Gaza. People of different views on Gaza have not been kind. Those would be the big ones. There are others. We had a couple not so long ago. We did a couple of articles where people talk advocating for veganism.
Mm,
And we don't have a discerned position on veganism. We have some general advice, I think, on you know particular kinds of diet are better for the environment, so on. And some friends have, we have a recognized body that's concerned for animals. So, it's ballpark of area for conversation. They, we got some responses from people who did not want to be told that they weren't allowed to eat meat or dairy. And the forthrightness with which they expressed their views was not what I would call Quaker plain speaking. It went beyond it. So it doesn't have to be a particularly it doesn't have to be one subject or the other.
yeah,
It can be any subject, but I would say trans in Israel have been the big ones.
yeah,
Trans in Israel and generally criticisms of trustees or BRN management. That's quite a big one where people can be again unkind.
right, right. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, look, one of the other questions that I got was, why don't we have more cartoons and competitions? And and one of the questions was, why don't they, what did he put? Like spot the ball, except spot the Quaker. And I think he had this image of you know, a picture with some kind of, bobble hat in the middle or something that you would
Yeah, I would love to have a cartoon. Um, Other magazines I've worked on where we've had cartoons, they've been expensive, but
really.
also you need the right cartoonist, right? So I worked with a really good cartoonist at the Church Times called Dave Walker. If you look at Dave Walker's cartoons about the church, he understands church. He can mock it while being part of it.
Yeah,
Absolutely brilliant. Um, you tell me the Quaker who can do that, and we'll sign him up. And so that often is
yeah,
the way, people have. I love suggestions. I wish people had told me these things rather than necessarily telling you. If they have suggestions, please. Suggestions are the lovely thing to read
yeah,
in the
yeah, yeah,
inbox. Somebody, issues, somebody wants, you know, and competition is a good one. Again, they can be quite hard to work out. Eleanor does some good work, I think, with crosswords and word searches and stuff on the I page. But of course, we've got to make them Quaker relevant. Otherwise, you might as well be
That's right.
you
Yeah.
might as well be reading The Guardian or whatever else. We have to do things with it. But if you know people who will do it, absolutely
So
let me
your
know.
inbox is open and you'd like it to be
Absolutely,
filled
yeah,
full of cartoons rather than
yeah. We can't
slurry.
publish what we don't know about. Is the
Yeah.
and believe me, we are very willing to publish all sorts of things. In terms of format,
Mm.
um, as I say, we take the discerned position of yearly meeting very seriously when it comes to the content, but form, absolutely.
Mm.
If you know a cartoonist, let me know.
Well, I suppose there'll be one that ChatGPT or AI will check.
Well, that's the. I mean, even if you told me like a line for a cartoon, I'd draw it. I draw. I'd find a way to draw it. I'm not. The time it takes to think them up, we'd end up with a fortnightly magazine rather than weekly.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
So what's the future for you then, Joe? I think you said you've been with the friend for 8 years. Uh,
is it
you said
eight?
18 you started, so
That's right. Yeah. So this year it'll be 8 years. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so we had a very sticky financial year. Um, Not the year just gone, but the year before. We lost a lot of money because I mean it's largely to do with the number of Quakers that there are. Um, and we did some appeals and we got a legacy, and last year was a better year, but I still don't feel like we still need to do some work to make ourselves sustainable for a modern future. There are a few things, we could do what we do until suddenly we reach a point where there aren't enough friends and go bust, or we can try to find a way to work in deeper into the 21st century. So there's still that challenge um, to make sure that the friend is secure financially. Um, and I think before I would want to try to do that um, before I could. I just think that's a thing that I need to try to do.
mm,
So that's a challenge for us, and we do inevitably. I think we need to be looking at kind of various patronage models rather than necessarily old like for like subscription models. We need to find ways to make the internet work monetarily a bit more. Um, these kinds of things. So these are definitely challenges that I want to take on. Um, and that, yeah, really business wise, that's the biggest thing for us. We'll be doing an update on our appeal in February, asking people to move up those tiers. I talked about standard to supporter tiers. And really, I can't. That's it's hard to think longer term when you know that in the shorter term you need to secure your future in order that you have a longer term. Um, so that's first.
mm. Well, you sound very committed to the friend style. I mean, that's the thing. You've been there 8 years, but you just probably feel like you're getting your feet under the table and you got the hang of it all, and you've still got a huge amount to contribute, I expect.
Well, I hope so. Like you say, I don't mind slow either.
Yeah. Well, that's been great. Anything else you want to tell us about with the friend? Anything else we can do to
No, I
sort
don't
of
think
call
so.
out?
I don't think so. No, I mean, I think we covered a lot. I'm sure
I mean, do you feel like these kinds of things, like podcasting and which I know they say is taking off more and more. I mean, in a way, I was surprised you're willing to engage with these YouTube podcast type things because do you see it as any
Oh,
threat or competition, or do you think
no.
it is an
In
entirely different
in
market?
fact, so that's something I should talk about. So we did year before last, I think we decided that we were going to do a podcast, and we did one episode, which I think was pretty well received. We had Judith Rhodes on talking about what Isaac Pennington would have sounded like. She figured out the same thing. It was really interesting. I did it with Rebecca, and then all sorts of financial things happened, and we weren't able to do the next issue. But we want to get back to that, so we want that to be a friend podcast. We absolutely, I think they're a great form.
Mm.
But and actually, YouTube, whatever. It's my partner Claire. She's sort of bemused by the fact that I almost never watch television. I basically watch YouTube because I love the niche of it, and
Yeah, me
I
too.
think more Quakers should engage in that way. One thing I did want to say that I hadn't said. One of the things people write to me and say is they say this person or this point of view should not be allowed. You know, should be effectively our version of what people would say is cancelled, right? And I think there are some forms of discourse that we wouldn't put in the friend. Partly, I think, to do with what I talked about the discerned position of friends. But I will talk to anybody.
Mm.
I will disagree. I'll think you're wrong. Not you particularly, but we might. I don't know what we'd.
Yeah.
But you know, I would. I have. I once interviewed. I think I might be the only person in the world. Nick Griffin, who used to be leader of the BNP.
Oh
I
yeah.
think I might be the only person in the world who interviewed him and threw an egg at him as a student. As I threw an egg at him as a student, and then I interviewed him as an adult because I don't think we get anywhere without conversation. It was Diana and John Lampen who wrote to us recently. Rebecca had done a news story where Irish friends had remembered the conversations that happened in the Troubles, and the people who sat down and talked at that time, the views they had of each other and the things that they'd done to each other and their communities had done to each other. And now people will say, I won't talk to them over things. Some of them are important, and some of them identity are big deals. But for me, and I realize I have it easier than most because I have more privilege than most, I'll talk to anybody. I would hope that I wouldn't exclude anybody because I think we don't get anywhere without really being honest about how we feel and investigating each other and opening ourselves to each other, whoever we are. And so that's important to me. I want any friends who watch this to know that I've never excluded anybody because of their name. There are views, we wouldn't publish somebody who wanted to say one race was superior to another.
Mm-hmm.
There are rules about the words that we can publish, but I will absolutely engage with anybody in whatever form. And I want people to know that we're open to that we've not excluded people and that we wouldn't, and that we think others shouldn't either. The difficult work of engagement sometimes needs to be done by proxy. I understand that it's hard for individuals. But I think this idea, we just say, because of something that you've said before, or because I know what your name is. There are very extreme occasions where there is a need for exclusion. I understand that often they'd have to be criminal in nature. But aside from those, I think it's really necessary that we try to find ways of engaging with each other, whether we have to use proxy or not. If they could do it in the Troubles, then I think most other situations we ought to be able to manage.
Mm. Yeah. Well, exactly. And I think the friend does have a big role to play in that, in bringing people together who don't necessarily see eye to eye, rather than these silo. Uh, this is what we have, isn't it? We have people in their silos and a
Yeah,
kind of segregation happening, which is not the way forward. And I'd love to see the friend podcast. I think that would be great. I mean, I can imagine that this is the time when these kinds of things are taking off. How you monetize that, I don't know,
yeah.
but I
Well,
think there would be interest.
as a digital communicator, try and look it up. It was called the Friend Live. I think we called this just one episode. It'll be out there somewhere. If you can find it, and then maybe give
Right.
us some
I'll have a look.
tips on digital communication, would be all ears.
Mm. Yeah, I'll have a look. Well, Joseph, I'll
Mm,
call you Joseph. Good to
thank
meet
you.
you, and thank you so
Yeah,
much for talking to us. I think it'll be of great interest to people. So
lovely. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank
thanks.
you.
Bye
Okay.
now.
Bye.